We are live. All right, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Just like everyone attending this event, we are all in different regions. And we today are talking about secondary characters. And secondary characters can show up in a story as a supportive family member, the honest to a fault best friend, to the antagonist that gives their character the heroic moment and kind of gives them that ha ha moment. They're essential to giving the main character their depth, and they can be just as important to a storyline as the world building or the plot twists. So today we'll delve into what it takes to create our secondary characters and why they're so important. But before we do that, just a few rules. If you'd like to get a better view of your panelists, just set your screen to gallery view. You go up in a little corner there and it'll say view. Set your screen to gallery view so you can see all of us. The chat roll is live for comments, and the Q&A is live for questions. So if you have questions, we should have time for questions later. And there will be sale information and book information popping up from Sandy in the chat. And that's it. Now, I did something a little different. If you know me and you know what I do with my panels and bios, I do not have them give me their basic bios, a little different. So today, I've asked our panelists to write their bios as if they were the secondary characters introducing themselves to the audience. So we will start with Michelle Benfield. Michelle is the slightly sardonic best friend of the main character who you can rely on to never judge the main character's choices and to always rock up with sufficient stacks to get through any emotional crisis. She wisecracks, wallpapers, but is a terrible cook. And then we have Tony. Tony's the crazy cat lady who doesn't seek the spotlight, lends a shoulder to cry on, adds a bit of comic relief, is the first one in line for a good time, and always has your back. Next up is Ashley Moore. Ashley is the fashionable queer best friend, ex-girlfriend, embrace the stereotype, who the main character knows will always tell the truth, whether that's about going after her love, the love of her life, or those really questionable shoes she just tried on. The distance between them doesn't matter. They're always going to be best friends. Oh, and she has a dog named Tallulah who's perfect for comic relief. Something's got to happen to those questionable shoes after all. Then we have Nicole Stilley. Nicole, introspective and observant friend who bites her tongue until she no longer can, is always there to back you up or bury the body. Whatever you need, once that's over, she's quick to do her infuriating I told you so dance, which we need to see, Nicole, while assuring you that everything will be all right. Last but certainly not least is Jane Walsh. Jane is a wallflower who has already found her cherished lady in waiting and now spends her time twirling her fan and sipping her tea as she encourages the other ladies in her life toward everlasting love. When not urging her friends to accept a scandalous rendezvous with a dashing love interest, she is yearning for her 19th century rest cure by the seaside. So that's our lovely panelists. And I do have questions for you all, but before that, Nicole, we need to see this I Told You So dance. If you're not.
It's the old one from Will and Grace. Yeah, told you so. Told you so.
Oh, perfect. Perfect.
Do that often.
All right. So the first question I have is what determines who your secondary characters will be? Let's start with Jane.
Hello, Anne. Thanks very much for the lovely introductions.
You're welcome.
So I write books that are very character driven, and I spend a lot of time crafting my main characters. And so I've got, the start of the story, I've got their flaws, their backstory, their goals, their motivations, and I've got that pretty much in my head. But secondary characters, I typically let them write themselves, and they reveal themselves to me on the page, but they always have a purpose. So I always think about who the cast of characters in the people's lives, like who they would be like in the people's lives that I'm writing. And I write Regency romance. So I'm typically writing about wealthy ladies, like often nobility, like certainly like well-born. So these people are going to have family, they're going to have personal servants, household servants, there's going to be social acquaintances at court, there's going to be people they meet along the way. But not all of these people, of course, need time on your page, right? Like I have a lot of books where like a lady in waiting or a lady's maid is a character, like a secondary character, but not all of my books necessitate that,
Yeah.
So it's really about picking and choosing who's going to drive story and narrative. Like if you want to show that your character is desirable, have somebody on the page to flirt with. And if you want to show that they're kind, like have somebody on the page that they can help. Like there's definitely always narrative reason. Like that's how I choose my secondary characters. Is like, what do I need to happen to showcase the main characters the most?
Okay. All right. Ashley?
So I think with my secondary characters, I also sort of let them write themselves. They are generally somewhat based on an amalgamation of people that I know. So never one specific person, but like a whole bunch of little things from other people that I've met or have been friends with. And then they always, in some way, are an opposite to a main character. So I've got, in the first book I wrote, I've got, the older woman who's very scared of coming out and is very reserved. Whereas I've got a young character in there who is also scared of coming out, but she's willing to do it more readily and more quickly. So she's sort of there to both like have someone for the older character to mentor, but also push the older character to do something.
Okay. All right. Michelle?
Yeah, I agree actually that they sort of write themselves. I think definitely not as fleshed out as a main character for obvious reasons, but I think that they're a sort of, in my mind anyway, they're like an instrument of the reader or of me or someone that's slightly annoyed. I was talking at a panel earlier about how much I love those sort of moody, strong, silent type, uncommunicative sort of heroes. And a good secondary character is perfect for that kind of character to draw them out. And so you can see bits of what they're like when they're not, with the love interest being sort of difficult, moody and emotionally resistant. So I think they serve that purpose. And sometimes I want a character to just be the person that's like, oh, come on, come on, like, which is how I am in my relationships with friends. Like, really, come on, they like you. This is stupid. I like that in a secondary character. And a bit of comic relief too is always good. Yeah.
Okay. Tony?
Yeah, no, I'm laughing at Michelle because I agree with that. But what determines my secondary character is always my main character. So when I start to write a book, I always flesh out my two main characters. And I really understand their voice, their complexities, their flaws, all of that. And then when I start thinking about the secondary characters, I want to develop my secondary characters to kind of offset the main character. So if I write a main character that's a little more introverted, I want to make sure that the secondary character is a little more extroverted so they can play off of each other well. I don't want a secondary character that just mirrors my main character. So what I look for in determining that is a really well-rounded character that's going to offset my main character. So I first start with my main characters, and then I'll move to the secondary characters. And as well, I'll always think, if my main character is this type of person in real life, who would she have kind of in her circle? What kind of personality would she be drawn to and stuff like that. So, and I make sure that secondary character is very real, but also kind of opposite so they can offset each other. And then I think it makes it it makes it kind of fun, and it moves the story along very well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cole?
I agree with Jane and Tony. I kind of base my secondary characters on the needs of my primary characters. Do they need a best friend, a parent, a sibling? What do they need for interaction and their backstory to fully flesh them out?
Okay. So basically, it is the truth that the secondary characters kind of give the main character their depth, in your opinions. The way the way you build your character also depends on the way their secondary character is in helping them reach their depth as a character in your book. Okay. All right. Second question. When creating your secondary characters, do you believe it's important to give them their own plots or backstories in your head to make them more realistic? Let's start with Nicole.
A very limited backstory. I don't want to get too caught up in the minutia of it. More the basic stuff, what they look like, their occupation, relationship status, that kind of thing, more than a deep dive into what their backstory is really like.
Okay. Michelle?
Yeah, I can't help myself. I think I'm that kind of a writer. I give them too much of a backstory. Everybody's got, even Tallulah's got a backstory if I was writing Tallulah in my book. So I do a bit. I think sometimes because they are, like, often I'll write family members that are sort of close to the main character, a sister or someone like that. So then you just end up just obsessing about where they fit in the family and what they were like when they grew up. So there's a bit of that. And I think it develops as the book goes along. You might start with not much, and then you realize through the scenes they have together that you've given them a bit more depth than you intended. Yeah.
Jane?
It really depends on the purpose of that secondary character. There's a lot of secondary characters that I have on the page that don't really have a lot of backstory, and I don't imagine a backstory for them. Like their purpose is maybe it's comic relief, or maybe it's to give advice to the main character, but I don't necessarily need them to have a backstory that kind of lives and breathes like in my head to determine like how they're going to act. Because it kind of like depends on other things. But there are secondary characters that is necessary for them to have a backstory because they might have, I guess maybe that's a difference between secondary and tertiary characters, but a lot of secondary characters, they don't drive the narrative plot that much on their own, but sometimes they do. Like in my most recent book, Seducing the Widow, which I happen to have right here, I really had two social backdrops to the story. And one of them is like the glittering London society, like high society, the ballrooms and, the backstabbing nobility, like those kind of characters. And then I also had a social backdrop of queer London, which was a gay tavern called the Queen and Scepter, which is more affectionately known as Queenies by the characters. And who goes to each event is very important, and why they would go to each kind of event was important. So there were secondary characters that needed a backstory because they needed a reason to go to the gay tavern, like they're not just going to kind of waltz in there, like unless they have a purpose and like they understand the risks and they're willing to take those risks. And that inspires the main characters to go there as well and to understand their queer selves and to really feel comfortable and supported. Like it's kind of through the work of the secondary characters. So it was necessary for those people to have a backstory, but there are certain other people that just go to maybe the ballrooms that I didn't really see the need to have too much of a deep understanding of the character.
And you mentioned tertiary characters and secondary characters. So for those that don't know, tertiary characters are the kind of the background characters, the ones that don't have that much of an effect on the main character. As the secondary characters do, the secondary characters could be family, someone really close to the main character. So just wanted to clear that out in the air. Ashley? We have a visitor.
My secondary characters have just enough of a backstory insofar as it is necessary that it be something that the main character would know about them. So, like, I've got a best friend character in my latest book, and they have, I'm sure, this long, complicated backstory that, led to their lives. But unless I write about them specifically, I don't really think about what that backstory might be.
Okay. Tony?
I'm joined by my secondary character here.
Yes, I see that.
No,
you can't have a panel without a cat.
It's a must. No, when I write my secondary characters, I do give them a very complex like background. And I do that. I want to make them very well-rounded, three-dimensional, complex. They've got maybe as many flaws and everything else as the main character, because when I bring them in and the dialogue hits or whatever in that scene, because they don't have as much screen time as the main character, I gotta know their backstory. So when they're doing dialogue, whether it's from 10 years ago, a situation is brought up with this main character, I need to know exactly who they are to each other in a very complex and in-depth way. So the dialogue and everything reflects that. And so that's why I'll spend a lot of time fleshing out my secondary characters, because I have to know when they interact in that short amount of time that they're doing it in what is perceived by the reader as real. Like, these guys have history. There's a reason they're, that this is the secondary character to this main character. So I have to know her as much as the main character, the secondary character as much as the main. So,
Okay, and on that note, I'll start you on the next question.
Oh,
How do
okay.
you make sure that your secondary characters stand out without taking anything away from your main character?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. When I do bring my secondary character in, at that point, they do have to share the spotlight with the main character. You're bringing them in for a reason.
Mhm.
And so if my main character is having a crisis or an emotional breakdown or whatever, there's a reason, there's a purpose. I'm going to bring the secondary character in to share the spotlight, even if it's comic relief or whatever. Maybe they have to reset the scene, challenge the main character, do something like that. But then I have to move her away. She's coming in, she's kind of sharing the spotlight, so she's got to stand out like a little bit, because she's got to advance the story, challenge the main character, do something to offset that scene, and then she steps out, and then the main character moves on. So we're still with the main character, even though for that moment they're sharing a little of that spotlight, enough for her to nudge, bump, do something
Yeah.
with the main character. And then we've advanced the story, and then we move on with the main character.
She takes her through to that next shift in the story.
Gotcha. Yeah, exactly.
Ashley?
Could you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Sure. How do you make sure that your secondary characters stand out without taking anything away from your main character?
Truthfully, I have no clue.
And that's fine to have that answer.
I sort of write very instinctively. I
Mhm.
don't, these aren't characters that I put a whole lot of thought behind. I
Mhm.
just sort of feel what they need to do. And I'm not it's not something that I really conceive of when I'm writing.
Okay. All right. And that's fine. And if there's a question that you're just like, I don't know, just let me know. That's fine. Jane?
I adore secondary characters that are memorable, flashy, like larger than life. I don't mind if they steal a scene or two in the book, to be honest, because the whole book is about the main characters. If you've got secondary characters that'll run away, I love that. And I've written a number of characters like that where there was one book that I had, The Accidental Bride, where the first half of the book is like a very frothy romp where they're running away to Gretna Green to stop a marriage from happening. And the second half of the book is a more serious, in-depth look of like making a sapphic relationship work in Regency England. But in the middle, when they get to Gretna Green and they're stopping the marriage, or they're trying to stop the marriage, they might not be successful. You have to read the book. But there's a farce. And that is a deliberate choice to separate the first and the second parts of the book. And the farce is led by the blacksmith character who's marrying off these people. And he is an absolutely ridiculous, kind of like a fool character, like in kind of like Shakespeare kind of parlance, where what he says seems like totally ridiculous and upside down, topsy-turvy. And then by the end of the book, you kind of realize that some of the things he said is actually, might be true about marriage and commitment, which is but I was happy for him to take over that part of the book because it was a confusing, chaotic scene where like a lot of moving parts were happening, and the reader is supposed to get kind of caught up and like wow, what's going on? And you're led in that direction by the blacksmith character, who is over the top, scene stealing, memorable, but he's only in one scene. And
Okay.
so a lot of this work is done when you realize like how much screen time or page time a character has.
Mhm.
Do they have their own point of view narratively? Like my secondary characters never have their own point of view scenes. Everything is from the point of character A or character B, and that's it. And so that's like a really good way to make sure that they don't take over the whole story. Like it's always well within like your characters to
Mhm.
drive the narrative, but sometimes it's just really fun to let loose and have characters that you don't need to worry about wrapping up their loose ends or why they're a certain way or like why they're so over the top. Like you can just let them have it, I find. I really like it.
Okay. All right. Nicole?
I try to just give them distinct characteristics to complement the main character. So, if my main character is shy or low key, I try to make my secondary characters outgoing or, aggressive. So it's just, it's always a little bit of an opposite so that they don't take it over, but they boost them up.
Okay. Michelle?
Yeah, I can't add much really to what Jane said. I think the point of view helps you out enormously. I think in that place, I think Anne made that comment in the Q&A as well. Like you don't give your secondary character a point of view; it's not allowed.
Yeah.
So that's what keeps you honest, I think, in that space. So even if they are a bit larger of life, or even if they're really interesting, it's never from their point of view. So that's why they're the secondary character. So I think that does help you out. When you've got, I've got characters that I really like them, and I think, yeah, they're really cool, but they're not the main character. So I think that's the
Yeah.
thing, isn't it? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to look at the Q&A, but you all did answer that. When you have some memorable secondary characters, how do you keep yourself from giving them a point of view? Which you all pretty much answered. And thank you, Anne. All right. So, some of you have already, I think, Jane, you've already done this. Have you ever written a secondary character based on, have you ever given a secondary character their own story or sequel? If so, what was it about them that inspired you to do so?
Was that for
So,
me?
Jane, I'll
Sorry.
start with you.
Yeah, okay. So all of my books really are secondary character
Yeah.
books. Like the first one I wrote, Her Lady to Love, it's a secondary character in the second book from the first book, and the third book also was secondary characters that came up in the first and second book. And then I wrote a three-book trilogy. So of course they were all secondary characters. It was a friend group, and each book got their own friend. So that was all secondary characters. So for my most recent book, Seducing the Widow, I actually consciously told myself, do not write this book thinking that there's going to be any character that gets their own book. Because
Mm-hmm.
I felt a little bit hemmed in by the third book of The Spinsters of Inverleigh.
Mm-hmm.
I knew that Maeve was going to get her book. Like, like when you're writing a group of friends and each friend
Mm-hmm.
has a book, like, that eventually you're going to get to a certain friend. And I felt a bit hemmed in by that choice. Like, I think it was more that I put certain characteristics on the page in previous books that then I was like, oh, but now I have to actually flesh these out and do the work of giving her a backstory because now she's a main character. And that was very
Mm-hmm.
challenging. So I told myself for the most recent book, don't even think about the secondary characters. Like, don't think about it with the idea that they might have their own books down the way. And I really felt like it was freeing. And it was probably the easiest time I've ever had writing characters. Like, a lot of
Mm-hmm.
them came on the page and I thought they were interesting. And unfortunately, now so interesting that despite my best intentions, I feel pretty sure that I'm going to have at least two books after this that are going to relate to these characters because I can't help myself, even when I try not to.
Well, that's good because people can continue on with the group. Michelle?
Yeah, Tony and I were talking about this because we wrote the Romance Lovers book club together, and it was such a lot of fun. And there's a secondary character in that called Alice, who is just a delightful secondary character, a sidekick almost. And at the very end of the book, we left a sort of Easter egg, I think they call it, at the very end, where she meets someone at the airport, implausibly on her way home or something. So we left the door open because she was a lot of fun. to write actually as a secondary character. So I don't know if you'd agree with that, Tony. But yeah, I've not really thought about it in terms of any of the other books that I've written, in terms of any spin-offs with any of those characters. There's plenty of characters in there that I really enjoy and really like, but they are where they are and they're kind of staying there. So
They have their place and they don't need to have. Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. Tony?
Yeah. Just kind of coattailing off of Michelle. We wrote this character named Alice, and at the time we were kind of thinking that maybe it would be fun to spin her off, but we haven't. We didn't. So I have not written a sequel with any of my secondary characters, but I like to give my secondary characters enough screen time, like in my books, to where they could then take the story to a standalone on their own and as a sequel. I like that. I like the secondary characters to kind of have that much time to where the readers are familiar with them, if I so chose to do that.
Mhm.
But so far, I haven't.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nicole?
I have not either. I would definitely be open to it if any of my secondary characters jumped out at me and I felt like they had a meatier story to tell. I would definitely do it, but I have not at this point.
Okay. Ashley?
Everything I've written, which is obviously more than I've published, I've had one secondary character that I've thought about maybe doing a sequel about,
Mm-hmm.
just because they played more of a part in the book than my secondary characters normally do. And so they're a bit more fleshed out. And I think the ways that I made them sort of interact with the main character, it left some possibility open of them being interesting enough to carry their own book.
Okay.
But I haven't done anything with them yet. So
But we have something to look forward to.
maybe.
I feel the need to confess, Anne, that two characters, secondary characters in Never Be the Same in my book, I gave them their own kind of mini happy ending too. I couldn't stop myself. So romantic. So I had the main character arc of romance and a little spin-off romance on the side. There's not anything there for a sequel, but I really enjoyed bringing them together. So
It's nice to give, those little people that are on the sideline that you kind of are curious about.
Yeah, they deserved it. They'd worked hard the whole book. Yeah.
Yes. They help that main character get to their happy ever after. Why not?
Yeah.
All right. Have you ever written a secondary character based on someone you know? Let's start with Ashley.
Not directly based on someone I know. And
Yeah, I know
definitely
you
not
said
just
you kind of conglomerate.
yeah, not just one person, but there are like tiny aspects of people I know who end up like mannerisms show up in my book. Like in my last book, one of the secondary characters calls the main character just friend, like capitalized F. How are you doing today, friend? And that's a thing that is from my own life, that I had a friend like that who we would just refer to each other as friend. Like, do you need a hug, friend? And that is something that I consciously sort of carried over into a book, but nothing about that person is in the character of the character.
Okay. Tony?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. All of my characters are either from kind of a friend that I know, or a celebrity, or a certain character on TV or in a movie. And I'll kick back to Michelle a little bit. When we wrote Alice, the secondary character in the book that we wrote together, we had Melissa McCarthy in mind. We wanted a character that was like her. And I like the fact that when we were talking about it, when we were brainstorming about it, we both knew the character well, I mean, as an actress. So we both knew how she would talk, how she would act, what her mannerisms were going to be. So modeling the character Alice, of the actress Melissa McCarthy, we knew exactly, like right away, we're like, oh, we've got this secondary character. We know how she's gonna come into a scene. We know how she might even steal the scene. We know the comic relief. We know all that. And it helped writing her voice every time we brought her into a scene. So for me, and definitely for us when we wrote that book, it really, really helped having somebody that we could kind of model that off of. Yeah.
So, Michelle, will you be talking to Melissa McCarthy when the GOAT takes the movie rights?
Give it a go, yeah.
All right, Michelle, how about you? Are there any other characters?
Yeah, the very first book I wrote, it was sort of mildly set within a football team. So the two protagonists are playing football and that's how they meet, kind of a workplace team. And I used to play football in my youth many years ago, and I put like the team captain, who I'm still friends with. I made a little cameo for her, and now I even gave her a husband, which she's never forgiven me for, just to make her laugh. So that was fun. So that's definitely her, the way she used to be really bossy about team selection and training and things like that. So that was fun. And generally, yeah, I think it's composites, like Ashley said. I think I'm just too nervous to put people in there that I know in case they read it and ask me, is that me? Tony and I were joking about the fact we wrote the Romance Lovers book club, and it's about an American who comes to Britain having, in a book club, read a book about an American who goes to Britain. And so we were saying people would think that was about us. But we haven't managed to do that yet, have we, Tony? You've not visited it. We've not done the London sightseeing thing. So yeah, composites the same, but not anyone I can think of. Yeah.
All right, Nicole.
All the time. Most of my characters are based on people I know, with tweaks, but most of them are people I know for sure.
All right, and Jane, I know because you write Regency. I don't know if you have any Regency type friends.
No, and I have not. I don't think I've ever based a secondary character really on somebody. I'm sure, there's probably some traits or dynamics that might come through just because, we're all a product of the environment that we live in. Like, of course, it's probably hard to not be influenced at all by your friends and family and coworkers and everything. Like, so there's probably elements that I'm kind of subconsciously aware of. But the only thing that I deliberately put in my book was not a character, but when I was writing my most recent book, I had a feeling that it would be the last book that I wrote with my cat by my side, because he was elderly, he was 15 years old, and he had some health problems. And as I was writing, he's been with me my whole career, and I was thinking it might be his time, and this might be the last book that he's really with me for. So I did include a little black cat in the book.
Oh.
And that's specifically for my black cat, Macbeth. And I gave him the name Socrates because I thought it would make my wife laugh, because our cat Macbeth was not very bright. And so I thought she would see the reference and that it would make her smile, which it did. So that's really the closest I've gotten to really putting a secondary character that I knew in my life.
I really wanted you to say, my lady in waiting that I have in my own life. Put her in the book. I really want you to have a lady in waiting. But
oh, how luxe.
Yeah.
All right, let's take an audience question. We have a question from Joni. Many of you said the secondary characters write themselves. Have any ever misbehaved or not helped the plot or main character in the way you intended, so you asked them or had to force them to do what you want? Let's start with Tony.
Have you, and I'm sorry, I didn't understand all that. Have you ever had them?
So have you ever had a secondary character that didn't quite fit the profile you wanted them to? So you had to either get rid of them or kind of change them to fit what you needed them to do.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. As the story progresses and I get to know the characters more and more, sometimes the secondary character that I wanted to have, or I thought I should have for the main character at the start of the book, isn't quite who she continues to be as the book progresses. So yeah, yes, I've had to shift and stuff like that. Absolutely.
All right. Nicole?
I haven't had to completely remove a character. I've definitely had to do some, editing and rewriting, but I generally create my secondary characters based on what the primary needs at that time. So I haven't had any specifically go to awry.
Go right. Ashley?
None of them have done that yet, but I fully acknowledge that in the way that I write, one of them totally could at some point. And yeah, then you just gotta figure out why they're reacting the way that they are and tweak something about that.
Okay. Michelle?
I think I really love a good villain, as a secondary character, someone who sort of creates a bit of trouble and conflict. And I've been surprised sometimes by just how dastardly they can be. Like I maybe didn't intend them to be that bad. And I think in life, I like to think that everybody's got redeeming. Well, not everybody. Let's figure out where we are politically. Not everybody's got redeeming features, but most have redeeming features. But a couple of times I've written those characters, and maybe I've just enjoyed it a bit too much, and they haven't redeemed themselves, and they've just been villainous to the very end. And I've been a bit surprised by how dark they've been, as villain characters. But I've never wanted to chop them, maybe rein them in a bit. Yeah.
Okay. Jane?
I've definitely had to either rewrite or change a secondary character because I start writing and then like they just kind of flow and they kind of dictate like what they want to do. And then sometimes in a second draft or even like later in the first draft, I'm like, that doesn't really help. Like every character on the page should be there for a reason. And sometimes you change direction on the manuscript or you change direction, from for the main characters, and then like that character just isn't relevant anymore. Like the reason that you originally brought them on isn't the reason that you need them to be there now. So I've definitely deleted characters, changed them. I used to try to shoehorn them in still, like where I would just be like, oh, like let me just tweak this and that. And then I was like, no, I'm holding the reins here. I'm writing this book. I can write them out if I need to. I have that power. So I'm a lot more ready to do that now than I was when I started my career.
Yeah, I think we sometimes forget that we have control of the characters. The characters don't have control of us.
Absolutely.
All right, so what would you say are the do's and don'ts for writing a secondary character? We'll start with Ashley.
This is going to be that question where I'm like, I have no clue.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't put that much intellectual thought into it that I could come up with a do or don't list.
Okay. All right. Jane?
I have a lot of thoughts on this one, so I'm going to limit it to 3. So I don't take up the whole panel here. I would say number 1 is a tiny thing, but a really important thing. I would say do not give them all similar names. Do not have a Timmy, a Tommy, and a Tammy as your secondary characters. It is super confusing for the reader. So that's kind of my number 1 easy tip. And then don't overclutter it. If your friend is really popular, like your main character is a friend who has 10 or 15 friends in their friend group, not all of those people need or deserve their own speaking role in the book. Don't overclutter it. It just bloats the book for no reason. And then I would say for my third do or don't, I would say make them memorable. Give them some kind of trait or a quirk or something so that if you have a character that only comes up a couple of times, the reader has to remember them in Act 2 and Act 3 from when they were introduced in Act 1. So something about them has to be memorable, either, a quirk or a name but something has to stand out so that later you're like, oh yes, that's who it was. It's the professor from the first scene, not having to really search your brain too much and think who is this person again? As if they're introduced for the first time. So those are kind of my 3. I probably have more, but I'm gonna let the rest of the panel say their piece.
Nicole?
Yeah, I do try to make them as interesting as possible without overshadowing the main characters. I mean, I want them interesting enough that the reader's not going to be bored when I start talking about them, but I
Mm,
don't want to spend too much time where it feels like filler. So I try to keep it, short and sweet, but interesting enough to warrant the pages in the book.
okay. Michelle?
I definitely can identify with what Jane said. I think I have a habit of giving everybody names that begin with H, and I don't realise that until on the read through, and then the editor or someone will say they all have a name that begins with H, and I'm like, but that's their names. I can't possibly change it now. And then you have to. And yeah, I think that's definitely a don't. Yeah, I think I also am guilty of was guilty. I learnt my lesson of that. Like a football team is an ensemble, isn't it? Like you don't need to know everybody in the football team. You just need to hear from everybody. Those pub scenes were like getting a bit out of hand at one point. So I think, yeah, I definitely resonate with what Jane said. Yeah, and I guess it's hard, but try and avoid stereotypes too. It's really hard, isn't it? There's only so many. There's only a best friend and a wise old sister, or that kind of thing. So I was just
Like all
trying.
the Hallmark movies.
Yeah, exactly. I was trying. I don't know, change it up a bit. That's the other do, I think. Yeah.
Tony?
I would say for a do, I make sure that they are unique and that they don't mirror the main character. They have to, they have to be memorable. They have to stand in their own voice. As a don't, I would say don't bring them in just to bring them into a scene. Make sure when you bring a secondary character into that scene, there's a purpose behind it. It moves the story forward. And just don't bring them in to bring them in. If you're bringing a secondary character in, your scene needs work beyond just bringing a secondary character in. Make sure when you do that, that it's moving the story forward and there's a purpose for it. So, yeah.
Okay. I don't see any other new questions from the audience, so I'm going to ask one off the cuff here. So, of all your books, who's your favorite secondary character? We'll start with Tony. I see her smiling. I think I might know, but I could be wrong.
I got to go with Alice. When we
Okay.
wrote Alice, we had so much fun with that secondary character. I mean, we just made her just funny. I mean, just funny. And I would love to meet her. When you do a secondary character and in the end you go, I would like to meet that person would be my friend. I would have a blast with that person. Then that would be probably my favorite.
Michelle?
That's a tough one, isn't it? I think in one book there's a sort of sister. Like I said, I'm from a big family. I have two sisters, and we're always being weary of each other's choices and trying not to say "I told you so" in a dancing Nicole kind of way. So there's definitely a sister, Denise, who it doesn't necessarily. It's like a composite of us as sisters who's sort of so weary of this sort of drama and the way this main character's behaving. And every time she's there, I just felt it's that sort of cruel warmth, I think, that families often dispense to each other, where they love you and they mean to be warm and there's a lot of love there, but it can be cruel. So I like that kind of a secondary character. Denise is a pretty good one. Yeah.
Ashley?
I've got this character in my second book named Gray, and I think Gray is the most fleshed out of all of my secondary characters, and I love them the most, probably because of that. And I just love their like effervescent energy that even when I'm writing a scene where they're tired, they're still trying to have the energy that they normally have. And I just love that about them.
Okay. Jane?
This is a hard question. It's unfair. It's cruel. It's unusual. I love so many of my secondary characters, and you are making me choose.
Yes.
Not fair, Anne. Not fair.
You could put them in order. So give them like top three.
So So, well, I guess if I have to choose one, I would choose, in my third book, Her Duchess to Desire. Anne is a duchess who's in a lavender marriage with a duke, the Duke of Hawthorne. And the Duke of Hawthorne might be my favorite secondary character, because what I was trying to do with that book was to write a Regency that the plot was like a standard heterosexual plot, but it turns out that the main characters are gay. So this is a duke and a duchess who were kind of meant to be together, who were meant to kind of rule society together, but they actually both are queer and both have like a distinct queer agenda for the people in their lives and how to protect the people in their lives from scrutiny. And I thought that the Duke was a really interesting character. Like, he ends up going to Paris and he hosts all of these really like out there gay parties because the heat is on him and not the people attending the parties. Like, but he's a duke and he can take that kind of scrutiny and no one's going to pursue him and put him in jail or kind of come after him, because he can protect the people who need that protection, that are going to attend these parties and reveal their queer identities to each other. He's creating the safe space, but at the same time, it creates a huge divide in the marriage that he has with the Duchess. So like the book is about each one of them has their own love story. Like the Duchess ends up falling in love with like an interior designer who's come to redecorate the house, basically trying to make it unlivable for the Duke when the Duke comes back because she's really angry at him. And there's so much about different kinds of relationships in that book that I really appreciated. Like different ways to love people that is not necessarily a romantic love. And so I really liked the characters in that one, but I love all of my secondary characters, so that's just one of the ones I love.
All right, Nicole?
My favorite is probably from my latest novel, The Rewind. Katie, who is my main character's best friend. She's very sarcastic and biting. And to use Michelle's term, which I love, she's full of cruel warmth. So it's just a really nice relationship they have. And I like her a lot.
All right, we only have a few minutes left, so quick roundabout of what you're working on now or what's coming out soon. So we will start with Ashley.
I am working on a sort of small town romance that takes place in a tiny town in the South between the mayor and the sheriff. And very much sort of going with Andy Griffith Show vibes.
Okay. Nicole?
Nothing right now. I'm still just, I'm actually kicking around some ideas. Nothing set in stone yet, though.
Okay. Tony?
Hollywood Hearts, it just came out in February, just now. And it's about an A-list actress who falls for a paparazzi, but she doesn't realize it's a paparazzi when she falls for her. And it's the paparazzi that actually took some pictures of her that got her in some hot water, and that reveals itself later in the book. So
trouble. Michelle?
Sorry, I got distracted by mayor and sheriff. I was like, when will that be out, Ashley? Sorry. Yeah, I'm working on a book called Give Me Your Hand, which is sort of age gap opposites attract romance about a climber who's a bit washed up and holed up in a Scottish sort of country mansion, and they send a very different young ghost writer to write her autobiography, and they clash, but then they don't. So yeah.
All right. And finally, Jane.
I'm working on my 8th Regency romance, The Debutante Dilemma, which will be out sometime in 2026. And that is about 2 debutantes who are marrying brothers. And as they kind of learn the dastardly family secrets of the family they're marrying into, they, of course, fall in love with each other instead.
Of course. Excellent. All right. That takes us right up into the time. Thank you all so much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I hope you learned more about the secondary characters who don't get as much glory as they should. And there's more coming up. There are sales going on. Please go pick up these books from these wonderful authors. And that is it. Have a good one, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.